The sun was beginning to set over the city as Danielle Carter drove through the streets in her brand new black luxury sedan. She had spent the last few months working tirelessly for this moment, and tonight was supposed to be her quiet victory lap before stepping into her new role. The weight of her responsibilities as the newly appointed chief of police hadn't fully settled yet, but she knew the job wouldn't be easy. She had worked her way up through the ranks with relentless determination, proving herself in every way possible. But no matter how much experience she had or how many cases she had solved, there were always those who doubted her abilities, especially in a position like this. As she cruised down the main road, lost in thought, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. A sigh escaped her lips as she checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding, hadn't broken any traffic laws. So why were they pulling her over? She signaled and pulled to the side of the road, resting her hands firmly on the steering wheel. Her heartbeat remained steady, but there was an unsettling feeling creeping in. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car behind her. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, while the other, slightly younger, carried an air of authority that seemed forced. They approached her vehicle cautiously, and when the older officer knocked on her window, she rolled it down smoothly. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice devoid of warmth. Danielle kept her face neutral as she reached for her purse. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" The younger cop smirked, crossing his arms. "Just routine. We need to make sure everything's in order." Routine. She knew that wasn't true. She had seen this happen countless times before. Drivers being stopped for no apparent reason other than a baseless suspicion. The difference now was that she wasn't just another citizen on the road. She was their new boss. She handed over her ID and vehicle documents, watching as the officers exchanged glances. The older cop studied her license for a moment, his brows furrowing. His expression shifted slightly before he looked back at her. "You from around here?" he asked, his tone still unreadable. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation. "I believe so, officer." The younger officer leaned in slightly, peering into her car as if expecting to find something incriminating. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" Danielle inhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Is there a reason for that request?" The older cop narrowed his eyes. "Ma'am, we need to verify a few things. Just step out, and this will be quick." She could feel the shift in their energy. This wasn't about a routine stop anymore. Something about her made them uneasy, and she had a strong feeling she knew what it was. But she wasn't going to make a scene, not yet. Instead, she calmly unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open, stepping out in a controlled, deliberate manner. Standing in front of them now, she noticed the subtle change in their demeanor. The younger officer, who had been exuding confidence just moments ago, suddenly seemed less certain. She wasn't flustered, wasn't intimidated. She stood tall, her posture authoritative but composed. The older cop cleared his throat. "Where are you headed tonight?" She tilted her head slightly. "Home after a long day at work." "And what do you do for work?" A slow smile crept onto Danielle's face. She could have answered immediately, but she let the question hang for a second longer than necessary. "I'm in law enforcement," she finally said. The officers exchanged another glance, but neither seemed to recognize her just yet. The younger cop scoffed, shaking his head. "That's so. What department?" Danielle folded her arms, watching their expressions carefully. "You could say I'm about to be very familiar with this one." Confusion flickered in their eyes, but they still weren't putting the pieces together. She could have told them right then and there who she was. She could have watched their faces turn pale as realization set in. But there was something about the moment, about the way they assumed they had the upper hand, that made her wait just a little longer. "Why don't you run my name through the system?" she suggested, her voice calm but firm. "Might clear up a few things." The older officer hesitated, but the younger one, still convinced of his own authority, turned and walked back to the patrol car. Danielle watched as he typed her information into the computer, his expression shifting almost instantly. His back stiffened, and then he turned toward his partner with wide eyes. The older cop frowned. "What is it?" The younger officer swallowed hard, looking between the screen and Danielle before finally muttering, "We might have a problem." Danielle remained still, her face unreadable. She had been in this position before, underestimated, doubted. But this was different. This time, she held all the power, and they had no idea what was coming next. The air felt heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. The older officer's jaw tightened as he watched his partner stare at the computer screen. The younger cop hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if he was second-guessing whether to process what he was seeing. His confidence from earlier had completely faded, replaced by something close to panic. Danielle stood in silence, her expression unreadable, waiting for them to piece it together. She wasn't about to help them out of their mess, not yet. They had stopped her without reason, assuming she was just another driver they could intimidate. Now they were discovering just how wrong they were. The older cop took a slow step toward the patrol car, leaning in to glance at the screen. His brows furrowed deeper as he read the words in front of him. His face went pale for just a second before he quickly masked his reaction. But Danielle saw it. She saw the shift the moment it clicked. He turned back to her, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, would you mind waiting right here for just a moment?" Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Is there a reason I need to wait?" His voice was more careful now, his tone no longer laced with authority, but with something else, uncertainty. "We just need to verify some things. Won't take long." Danielle exhaled slowly, glancing between the two officers. She could see the younger one was nervous, avoiding eye contact now, shifting uncomfortably where he stood. They both knew they had messed up. They were just trying to figure out how to handle it without making things worse. As the silence stretched, she let her mind drift back to the road that had brought her here. Years of hard work, pushing through barriers, proving herself again and again in a system that hadn't always welcomed her. She had been a beat cop, a detective, and most recently, a captain before being appointed as the new chief of police for this very division. She knew every policy, every procedure. She knew how these officers were supposed to conduct themselves, and she knew when they were abusing their power. She had fought for this role because she wanted to change the way things were done. She wanted to build trust between law enforcement and the community, to eliminate the kind of profiling that had just happened to her. And yet, here she was on the receiving end of it. The older officer took a deep breath, turning back toward her. His voice was measured, but she could tell he was struggling to keep his composure. "Do you mind telling us where you were headed tonight again?" Danielle's gaze stayed steady. "I already told you. I was on my way home after work." The younger cop finally spoke, his voice lower than before. We just wanted to make sure everything was in order." Danielle tilted her head slightly. "So was there an actual reason you pulled me over?" The officers exchanged another glance. They had nothing. No traffic violation. No probable cause. Just their own assumptions. The older cop exhaled. It was a routine stop. Danielle let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Routine," she repeated. "You sure about that?" The younger officer opened his mouth as if to say something, but quickly shut it. He looked toward his partner, as if silently begging him to take the lead. Danielle could feel the weight of the moment settling over them. They had made a mistake, and they knew it. The question now was whether they were going to own up to it or try to cover it up. She watched as the older officer ran a hand over his face, clearly frustrated, not at her, but at the situation they had put themselves in. He straightened, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, we—" Before he could finish, the radio on his shoulder crackled to life. A dispatch call. Another unit needing assistance a few blocks away. The officers hesitated for only a second before the older one reached up, pressing the button on his radio. Unit 12 responding. En route. Danielle knew they saw this as their out. A way to walk away from their mistake without fully addressing it. She could have let them. She could have watched them drive away and pretended none of this had happened. But that wasn't who she was. As the officers turned back toward their patrol car, she finally spoke again, her voice firm but calm. "Before you go, I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." The older officer paused, his shoulders tensing. The younger one turned slowly, eyes wide. Danielle took a step closer, her presence commanding. "Because this is exactly why I'm here." The officers were frozen, waiting for her next words. She could see it in their eyes now, the realization, the weight of what they had done. And for the first time since the stop began, it was no longer her who was under scrutiny. It was them. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on the two officers. Danielle could see the hesitation in their eyes, the uncertainty of how to proceed now that they realized who she was. The older officer, who had been leading the stop, glanced at his partner, as if silently trying to decide whether they should push forward or cut their losses and walk away. Danielle, however, wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. She crossed her arms, her expression calm but firm. So she said, breaking the tension, "Are you going to answer my question?" The younger officer swallowed hard. "What question, ma'am?" She raised an eyebrow. "Why was I pulled over?" The older officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Like I said earlier, it was just a routine stop." Danielle let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Routine," she repeated, nodding slowly. "So you regularly stop people driving home from work for no reason?" The officer hesitated. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" She pressed. The younger cop looked away, his hands clasped in front of him, his nerves obvious now. He seemed much less sure of himself than when he had approached her vehicle earlier. His confidence cracked under the realization of who he had just stopped. Danielle sighed, studying both of them carefully. She wasn't here to humiliate them, but she also wasn't going to let them dismiss this as if it had never happened. "You see," she said, keeping her tone steady, "this is exactly the problem I've been talking about since the day I stepped into this role. You stop someone like me, without cause, because of what? A gut feeling? A hunch?" Neither officer responded. Danielle continued, her voice carrying more weight now. "And what happens when it's not me? What happens when it's a young black man who doesn't have a badge? Or a single mother on her way home to her kids? What do you tell them when you pull them over for no reason?" The older officer shifted again, his face tight. "Look, Chief." She held up a hand, stopping him. "No, don't call me Chief now. Because you didn't know who I was when you stopped me. And that's the problem." The younger officer's face flushed, and he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. It wasn't personal. Danielle tilted her head. It's always personal when someone feels like they don't belong on their own streets. The older officer let out a slow breath. "This isn't what it looks like." Danielle gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like." She let her words settle before adding, "And you know it." The two officers stood stiffly, unsure of their next move. Danielle could feel the frustration bubbling beneath the surface, not just from this moment, but from every time she had heard a story like this. Every time she had sat across from a community member who felt powerless against the very system meant to protect them. It was different now because it was happening to her, but the feeling was the same. She glanced at their patrol car, the lights still flashing softly against the dark pavement. She knew they were hoping she'd let this go, that she'd accept some half-hearted apology and let them rush off to their next call without consequence. But that wasn't happening. She turned her gaze back to them, her voice unwavering. "You both have a choice right now," she said. "You can walk away from this moment and pretend it didn't happen. Or you can acknowledge the problem and decide to do better." The older officer's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The younger one looked down at his hands, the weight of the moment settling in. Danielle continued, her tone softer but no less firm. "I'm not asking for excuses. I'm asking for accountability." The younger officer finally looked up at her, his face conflicted. "We didn't mean any harm." "That's the problem," she said simply. "You don't think harm is being done, but it is." Another pause. This time, longer. Danielle didn't expect a full revelation in this moment. She knew change didn't happen overnight. But what mattered was planting the seed, the undeniable truth that they had been part of the problem. The older officer straightened, inhaling deeply. "What happens now?" Danielle studied him. "That depends. Are you willing to have an honest conversation about why this happened?" The officers exchanged glances again. The discomfort in their eyes hadn't faded, but there was something else now too. An acknowledgement, even if they weren't ready to say it out loud yet. Danielle knew this wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time that night, she saw something shift. And that was enough for now. The tension between them lingered in the night air, thick and unspoken. The flashing lights from the patrol car cast an eerie glow on Danielle's face, but she remained still, waiting. She could see the hesitation in their eyes, the internal battle playing out. They had made a mistake, and they knew it. But would they own up to it? The older officer exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. "Look, Chief." He started but quickly caught himself, realizing his slip. His jaw tightened as he corrected himself. "I mean, ma'am." Danielle didn't break eye contact. She wanted them to feel the weight of this moment. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about making them see. Really see. The younger officer cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "We were just doing our job," he muttered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. Even he didn't believe those words anymore. Danielle let the silence stretch. She had learned a long time ago that silence could be more powerful than shouting. People filled silence with their own thoughts, their own guilt. And right now she could see the wheels turning in their heads. A voice crackled through the radio on the older officer's belt, static breaking the uneasy quiet. He reached for it instinctively, but hesitated, as if afraid to turn his back on the situation. Danielle noticed that. That hesitation. It told her everything she needed to know. He was second-guessing himself. She took a slow step forward, keeping her voice calm but firm. "You know what bothers me most about this?" she asked. Neither officer responded, but she could tell they were listening. "It's not that you stopped me," she continued. "It's that even now, after realizing who I am, you're still trying to justify it instead of admitting you were wrong." The older officer's mouth pressed into a thin line. The younger one looked down, his fingers twitching near his belt. The weight of the moment was settling in, but she needed to push just a little further. "If I weren't the chief," she said slowly, "if I weren't in this position, how would this have ended?" The older officer shifted, clearly uncomfortable. That's not fair. Danielle's eyebrows lifted slightly. Isn't it? The younger officer finally looked up, his expression conflicted. We never meant tow. To what? Danielle interrupted, keeping her tone steady. To make someone feel small. To make them question their own presence on a street they have every right to be on. The older officer's radio crackled again, more urgent this time. He grabbed it quickly, pressing the button. Unit 23, stand by, he said, his voice tight. Danielle took another step closer. She wasn't trying to intimidate them. She wanted them to understand. I need you both to ask yourselves something, she said, her voice softer now. Would you have stopped me if I didn't look the way I do? The question lingered, heavy in the night air. The younger officer swallowed hard, his face betraying the internal battle he was fighting. The older officer, however, still held firm, though his shoulders had dropped slightly. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been minutes ago. Danielle let out a slow breath. You have a choice, she said finally. Right now, you can either keep pretending this was just another stop, or you can be honest about why you made it. The patrol car's radio buzzed again, another voice calling for their response. The older officer hesitated before reaching for it. Dispatch, we're clear, he said, his voice quieter than before. Danielle watched them carefully. She wasn't expecting a full confession. Not yet. But she needed them to walk away from this night thinking about it, remembering it. The younger officer met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. He looked like he wanted to say something, but held back. The older officer, however, straightened his posture, a small wall rebuilding between them. We should get going, he said stiffly, looking at his partner. Danielle nodded slowly. Yes, she agreed. You should. She stepped back as the two officers exchanged one final glance before turning toward their patrol car. The younger one hesitated for a brief second before following his partner. As they got inside and the car pulled away, Danielle stood there, watching them go. The night was quiet again, but something had changed. She had seen it in their eyes. A crack in the foundation. A seed of doubt. And sometimes that was enough to start a storm. As the patrol car disappeared into the night, Danielle took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension that still clung to her. This wasn't the first time she had been in a situation like this, but it was the first time since becoming chief. And that changed everything. She knew those officers would go back to their station, replaying the night in their minds, but what mattered most was whether they would actually learn from it. She turned back toward her car, ready to leave this moment behind, but just as she reached for the door handle, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. For a second, she considered ignoring it, but something in her gut told her to answer. Hello, she said cautiously. A low voice crackled on the other end. Chief Reynolds. Her grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? There was a pause, then a breath. This is Officer Lewis. I need to talk to you. It's important. Danielle's mind immediately went back to the younger officer from earlier. She hadn't caught his name, but something told her this was him. Her heart rate picked up. Why was he calling her? She stepped away from her car, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. All right, Officer Lewis, she said carefully. What is it? There was another pause before he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I think something's wrong at the precinct. I can't talk here, but I need to meet you. Alone. Danielle's instincts flared. This wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. Something else was going on. She glanced at the dimly lit street, her thoughts racing. Where? She asked. He hesitated. There's an old diner on 5th and Broad. Midnight, Please, Chief, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't serious. Before she could ask anything else, the line went dead. Danielle lowered the phone slowly, her mind now spinning in 100 different directions. What had she just stumbled into? She knew she should leave it alone, wait until morning, bring in a trusted officer to assess the situation. But something about Lewis's voice told her she couldn't afford to wait. He was scared. And if a cop was scared of his own precinct, then whatever was happening was bigger than just a routine stop gone wrong. She glanced at the time. 11:37 p.m. If she was going to do this, she needed to go now. The drive to the diner felt longer than it should have. Every set of headlights in her rear view felt like they were following her. Every shadow in an alley felt like someone watching. She had dealt with corruption before, seen what unchecked power could do. But this was different. This was inside her own house. When she pulled up to the diner, it was nearly empty except for an older man behind the counter and a single figure sitting in a booth near the back. Lewis. Danielle slid into the seat across from him. His face was tense, his knee bouncing slightly under the table. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "I shouldn't be here," he said under his breath, eyes darting toward the door. "If they find out I'm talking to you." Danielle leaned forward, keeping her voice calm. "Who? What's going on?" Lewis swallowed hard. "Chief, something isn't right. I've been noticing things. Files going missing. Reports being rewritten. And it's not just little things. It's cases. Big ones. People getting charges dropped for no reason. Evidence disappearing. And whenever I ask about it, I get shut down." Danielle felt her stomach tighten. Corruption wasn't new, but if it was this deep, this systematic, then she had bigger problems than a couple of bad officers. "Who's behind it?" she asked. Lewis shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I think," he hesitated, lowering his voice, "I think tonight's stop wasn't random." Danielle's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He looked around again before meeting her eyes. "I think they knew who you were before they pulled you over. I think they were testing you." A chill ran through her. If what he was saying was true, then this was bigger than a traffic stop. Someone wanted to see how she'd react, and that meant they knew she was a problem for them. Lewis leaned in even closer. "You have to be careful, Chief. If they see you digging, they won't just sit back and watch." Danielle sat back slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. If the department was compromised, then the people of this city were at risk. And now she was in the middle of it. Danielle sat in silence for a moment, letting Lewis's words settle. The weight of the situation pressed against her, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. If there were people inside her own department trying to manipulate the system, she needed to expose them. But she had to be smart about it. She glanced around the nearly empty diner, making sure no one was watching too closely. Then she leaned in, her voice steady but low. "Lewis, I need you to be honest with me. Do you have any proof?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. "I don't have much, but I've been keeping notes. There's something bigger at play here, Chief. It's not just officers looking the other way. Someone higher up is controlling this." Danielle exhaled slowly. She had suspected corruption, but if it reached beyond just a few officers, she needed to be extremely careful. "I need you to get me everything you have. Names, dates, any documents you can find. And don't tell anyone else about this meeting. Can you do that?" Lewis nodded, but the fear in his eyes remained. "Yeah, but Chief, be careful. If they're watching you, they won't hesitate to act if they think you're a threat." Danielle gave him a reassuring nod before standing up. She had dealt with criminals before, but this was different. This was betrayal from within. She needed to act fast. As she stepped out of the diner, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. Was it paranoia, or was she truly being watched? She couldn't take any chances. Instead of heading home, she drove straight to the office. If this conspiracy went deep, she needed to get ahead of it before they made their next move. Inside the precinct, the halls were quiet. The late-night shift was minimal, mostly desk officers processing paperwork. She walked past them, heading straight for her office. As soon as she shut the door, she pulled up the department's internal database. If there were any erased reports or suspicious case files, she needed to find them before they disappeared completely. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, scanning through old case records. Just as Lewis had said, there were inconsistencies. Arrests with no follow-ups, charges that had suddenly been dropped. And one name kept appearing in those files, a name that made her stomach drop. Captain Harris. He had been on the force for years, respected, even feared. But now, looking at these reports, Danielle saw a pattern. Harris wasn't just covering things up. He was orchestrating something much bigger. Before she could think through her next move, a knock on her office door made her freeze. She quickly minimized the screen. "Come in." The door opened, and there stood Captain Harris himself, his expression unreadable. "Chief, working late." Danielle kept her face neutral, forcing a small smile. "Just catching up on some paperwork. What brings you in?" Harris stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I heard you had an interesting encounter tonight." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, a quiet warning. Danielle leaned back in her chair. "Routine stop. Nothing I couldn't handle." He chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's what I like about you, Chief. Always staying composed." But here's the thing. He placed both hands on her desk, leaning in slightly. "Sometimes asking too many questions can make things difficult. And I'd hate to see you run into any unnecessary difficulties." There it was. A threat, thinly veiled under the guise of friendly advice. Danielle felt a slow fire build inside her, but she didn't show it. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. "Well, Captain, I appreciate the concern. But I took this job to serve this city, and I intend to do just that." Harris held her stare for a moment before pushing off the desk and straightening his jacket. "Good. Just remember, Chief, the department runs smoother when we all play our part." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Danielle waited until she heard his footsteps fade before letting out a slow breath. This was it. The confirmation she needed. Harris wasn't just involved, he was leading it. And now he knew she was onto him. She grabbed her phone and dialed Lewis. He answered immediately. "Chief." "I need you to meet me first thing in the morning," she said firmly. "And bring everything you have. We're taking this down." There was a pause, then Lewis's voice, steady but determined. "Understood." As Danielle ended the call, she knew there was no turning back. Harris thought he could intimidate her, but he underestimated one thing. She wasn't just another officer. She was the chief of police, and she wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Danielle arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. The air felt heavier, charged with the weight of everything that had unfolded the night before. She had barely slept, but her mind was sharp. Today was the day she made her move.